Also, OG, do you consent to be recorded?
Yeah, that's all good with us.
Okay.
Just give me like 2 seconds. I'm just setting my paper up.
All good.
I will turn my camera on as well. Panel, fundamentally in this debate, there was a basic level of economic activity that was required to keep the human population alive, that regardless of the incentives that we specifically had in this debate to protect non-human animals, obviously corporations and governments had an incentive to provide to their citizens. That meant that this debate was not about weighing up a world in which we're able to entirely prioritize the needs of animals, because there was no incentive for actors with agency to do so in this debate. This debate was about the relative extent of funding and R&D development that you could get into sustainable technology, into biodiversity protection, into the protection of specific niches, into the mitigation of the devastating impacts of climate change on billions of animals around the world. Opening government is the side that is uniquely going to prove to you why we are able to give those non-human animals those benefits, why we were able to ameliorate some of the incredible harms of climate change and of economic degradation in this debate. I'm going to do 3 things for you. The first thing is I'm going to establish some quick points in setup, then I'm going to give you 2 substantive contributions. The first is about how sustained economic growth uniquely enables the protection of habitat, biodiversity, and other forms of incredibly important resistance to the impacts of climate change. The second point is about how we uniquely engender sustainable growth as corporations recognize that this is the only way forward. Firstly, a couple of points in setup. The first thing to set up here is what the interests of non-human animals likely are, noting that, I am not a non-human animal, unfortunately. Some points to set up then. The first thing to say is that they are interested in their environments and habitats being preserved. Obviously, they need things like grazing fields, watering holes, and also specific environmental biodiversity balances to continue to be met in order to survive. The second thing to say is that, unfortunately, we are beyond certain tipping points associated with climate change. That is to say, there is just some environmental damage that is irreversible at this point. That means that this debate for quite a large proportion of the non-human animals we were talking about was primarily about mitigating the devastating impacts of climate change, which obviously required a large amount of capital expenditure. The second thing to set up in this debate is simply what we mean when we talk about these terms of stagnation and growth. Firstly, on stagnation, note that stagnation does not mean that there is decreased economic activity. It means that there is decreased relative economic growth. That means a couple of things. The first thing is that you still do all the stuff. That is to say that in a period of economic stagnation, you do not simply stop producing or stop mining or stop engaging in economic activity. It is just that the relative growth associated with that activity is decreased. The second thing to say is that in periods of economic stagnation, we empirically see that often governments and corporations are incentivized to engage in more economic growth because they attempt to reverse the adverse impacts of economic stagnation and of the slowing down of economic activity. The last thing to set up here is that there is obviously just limited relative power of money, which means that you're likely to get worse investment. More on that later. Secondly, on growth, this just means the capacity that you have to have like a healthy economy that has relatively high consumer choice, but also the amount of return you can get on things like sustainable R&D. Note that because sustained economic growth means we are growing into the future, this rate is obviously not focused on the growth of depleting resources like fossil fuels, because obviously the incentive is to switch to industries and other things that are likely to lead to sustained economic growth. So firstly then on why we are able to best protect biodiversity and habitats on opening government. The first thing to say here is how economic stagnation is likely to uniquely change spending patterns. Note that, as I framed to you earlier, there is a certain level of economic activity that is simply necessary to maintain to keep the human population alive. But obviously the companies that are comprised of human beings and that sell to human human beings and that the governments that serve those human beings have an incentive to maintain. I think that what that means is that if those governments and companies are not growing, then obviously they have limited money, and that means that they are likely to make trade-offs about where they ought allocate that limited amount of capital that they now have. The first thing that I think to say is that obviously research and development, particularly into things that do not directly impact human beings, are a secondary priority to things like increasing the relative amount of economic activity. That means that they have limited incentive to engage in research and development, but they also have significantly limited capacity to do so, even if they wanted to, purely because of that way up of incentive structure. The second thing, though, is that there is an added incentive for these actors to mitigate harms. That is to say that they do think that they are actively incentivized to stem the problem rather than engage in R&D. Note that this is not about creating more economic growth. It is simply about trying to ameliorate the problem. What then are they likely to spend this money on in the counterfactual? The first thing to say is that corporations are incredibly likely to engage in behavior like outsourcing production to jurisdictions with lower relative costs to attempt to offset the negative harms of economic stagnation that they face at a corporate level. I think that means that you're just much more likely to get an uptick in economic activity and production activity specifically in jurisdictions that have incredibly less stringent environmental regulation. The second thing to say is that economic stagnation obviously leads to political instability in high investment developing countries. And I think that that means that you are likely to decrease the appetite for sustainable investment because particularly risk-averse investors are likely to perceive that there are going to be limited capacity for return on that investment. I think that what that means is that you are now locked into financing options that engender bad debt. These were debts, for example, where were tied to resource exploitation or austerity measures that were likely to cyclically engender this kind of economic stagnation. The last thing to say, though, is that even if this op bench is able to prove that perhaps there is less mining in the short term, I think the associated response later, no thank you, is likely to be incredibly exaggerated. Why does this uniquely harm animals? The first thing is that you simply lose the impact of mitigatory research and development. This was things like research into forest conservation in the Democratic Republic of Congo or disease resistance for crops and animals. The second thing to say was that economic deprivation was likely to exacerbate other issues. For example, food insecurity, which was likely to actually just lead to heightened hunting and engagement, for example, in the grazing fields of animals. For example, the fact that thousands of bonobos have been hunted in the wake of food insecurity. I think that what this uniquely proves is that we don't have to prove that these kinds of harms happen to all of these animals. We were often talking about incredibly tenuous ecosystems in which a loss in a critical number of these animals was likely to lead to devastating harms. The third thing to say was that you increase the level of exploitative debt, which obviously had negative externalities for things like waterways and mining. The last thing to say is that corporations spend money that they otherwise would have spent on things like safe dumping on these kinds of more negative things. On comparative, we simply have more money that can be invested into research and development, which is secondary, but also still attractive to these companies when they have the capacity to do it. That means you can get forest conservation, you can get disease resistance research, but must concede that there is some level of economic growth that is required. We are the only side that enables that economic growth to be actualized in the interest of these non-human animals. Proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for their address and remind all speakers that you are meant to take a POI, and I now invite the Leader of the Opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, perfect. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. During COVID-19, there was an all-time low in the amount of pollution that was let out into the atmosphere because economic activity was not increasing. We think that when economic activity increases, there's going to be greater pollution, climate change effects, etc., that are going to harm animals. A few things I'll do in this speech. Firstly, talking about characterization, which I think opening government misses, but secondly, talking about why we get less resource extraction on our side of the house, co-opting the sustainable technology arguments that OG wanted to talk about. Thirdly, talking about why there's less population growth, and finally, less consumerism on our side of the house. Firstly, on characterization. I think it's important that this debate is not about whether we choose to stagnate the economy or choose growth. It's about which ends up happening. So that is to say, there are factors that cause one or the other. For instance, we're going to prove to you that sustained global economic growth necessarily only happens in a world where more oil reserves are discovered and therefore resource extraction increases, which means that on their side of the house, this type of growth is a is an effect of this increased oil extraction and increased reserve discovery, which means they're going to have to deal with the impacts of resource extraction. More on that later. Secondly, I think even if it is a non-zero amount of economic activity on our side of the house, it is still reduced compared to their side of the house. And we're going to say that this reduced activity still means there is less pollution, less effects of climate change. And finally, oh yeah, that's it. So firstly then on why we get less resource extraction on our side of the house. Firstly here, global economic growth implies that developing, developed, and resource economies alike are growing. What does this mean? For resource economies to be able to grow, they must extract more wealth and resources. This is because global economic growth is typically associated with the discovery of new oil reserves, because this cheapens oil and reduces the comparative advantage of green technology, helping resource economies. The only feasible way to promote economic growth is by increasing either human capital or natural capital. And that is to say, human capital is not likely to be the reason for sustainable economic growth on their side of the house, since developing and resource economies, which make up the majority of the world, have limited educational capacity in the status quo. So in order to be able to grow this, they need to spend on education instead of on investments. And that's more likely to cause economic stagnation in the short term than it is to cause global economic growth. That is to say, the only way these countries can have sustainable economic growth right now is by gaining more natural capital or resource capital, which happens through the discovery of more oil reserves. That means when they discover more of these oil reserves, they're more likely to extract these resources and create the harms that oil extraction already does. That is to say, more greenhouse gas emissions, etc., that worsen the impacts of climate change and push us closer to the brink of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming that will harm animals through ocean acidification, climate change, etc. I want to briefly rebut this idea of green technology and sustainable technology getting cheaper on their side of the house and being more adopted. I think it is very strange that they don't give a single example of what type of R&D is going to be discovered on their side of the house that's going to help non-human animals so much, given that green technology is already quite well developed and cheap. For instance, cheap photovoltaics are developed in Vietnam already that the US is actually scared of. Most of the economies in Latin America have renewable energy at a high level. Countries like Uruguay are 100% green technology because things like wind energy and biomass production are already quite cheap. So it is unclear what the marginal impact that's going to happen from their increased investment in R&D on their side of the houses. What do we tell you is instead important? Instead of technological development, the thing that is important is mass adoption of this sort of technology, which only happens on our side of the house because this requires political action. What does this look like? Economic stagnation is going to lead to more adoption and political support because, one, governments need to show that they're doing something radical when their economy is stagnating, when people are unhappy, because that is when there's most likely to, when the people are most likely to advocate to doing something radical. Why is this likely to be a switch towards green technology? Firstly, on our side of the house, we characterize to you that economic stagnation likely results because there are no oil reserves being continuously discovered, since in the absence of the discovery of oil reserves, it is unlikely that resource and developing economies are likely to grow, which is necessary for sustained economic global growth. Secondly, we think that it is likely that they adopt green technology, given that this reduces long-term costs in an uncertainty of a future that oil will exist, which means that by reducing long-term costs through the adoption of green technology, countries and governments are able to give some sort of future hope that does not currently exist to their citizens. Thirdly, here, it also allows for the growth of a new industry, which looks favorable to voters because the country can attract new investors into their economy when they're growing a new industry and mass adopting a technology that was previously less there. And this also creates more opportunities for workers as well. What this means is that on our side of the house, countries like the US are more likely to adopt green technology because this is what causes, because in the short term, they're experiencing economic stagnation that requires them to make some sort of important move that would not happen in a world where they would discover oil reserves and immediately start growing by using those oil reserves. That is what a government's world looks like. Resource extraction is bad for animals for very obvious reasons. It destroys habitats. It causes things like oil spill to happen, and extraction involves the emission of greenhouse gases. Secondly, then, why are you going to get less population growth on our side, and why is this a good thing? Economic stagnation means that people don't feel comfortable adding a child to the mix. They're experiencing inflation, which means their economy is reducing in real value over time, which means they can't support an additional human being in their family. Thirdly, people are more pessimistic about where the world is going, so they're unlikely to feel as though they can bring a child into the world who can have a high quality of life. And fourthly, Gov might say that more economic growth implies a more informed and educated populace who makes better decisions, but this is not going to be the case given the analysis we give you on why sustained economic growth likely results from resource extraction. Why then is it good that we get less population growth? Firstly, there's less land use if people don't need as much space to live. But secondly, there's less of a strain on resources because people need to produce less food and resources if there are fewer of them. Before I move on, closing.
Yeah, this is just objectively untrue, right? If you look at correlation between earnings and number of children, poorer countries tend to have more kids, and even in the United States, poorer people tend to have more kids. So this is just
so that's
against
what I just
reality.
responded to. That's what I just responded to. The reason richer countries have fewer children is because they're better educated. But the reason why sustained economic global growth would happen is not because of education, but rather because of resource extraction, because that's the only way resource economies in developing countries that make the majority of the world right now are able to have sustained global growth. Lastly, then, on why we get less consumerism on our side of the house. More economic growth means that people have more extra money for spending. Companies take advantage of this by selling us things that we don't need and telling us that we want it through the creation of artificial demand. What does this look like? They do things like producing fast fashion, which involves production processes that are extremely harmful for the environment. They overuse resources such as water and pollute the air, which is extremely bad for animals and their ability to sustain life, since they're not able to get access to clean water that is necessary to sustain life, as well as the fact that air pollution means that there's worsened effects of climate change and less breathable air. When we get less consumerism on our side of the house, it means that people are only buying the things that they absolutely need. Companies have less of an incentive to overproduce. And we think that production processes themselves are some of the most harmful impacts of climate change and habitat destruction. And when we prevent these sorts of processes on our side of the house, when economic stagnation reduces demand, we are able to mitigate these effects that harm non-human animals. Proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the leader of the opposition, and I now invite the DPM. DPM.
I think it's a really big problem when they tell you that this will now motivate people to mobilize politically in ways that are radical. Because what I think this means in the majority of tenuous democracies that were already straddling the line of illiberalism was probably civil war. I think that at the point at which you experience such intense economic deprivation that you simply could not afford, at the point at which you were now not able to provide food for your families, that was probably what inflamed the tensions that probably pre-existed in those countries. That was probably what created power vacuums that were particularly perverse. That was probably what threw your country into the jaws of violence. At that point that you believe that economic stagnation, particularly for countries that were vulnerable, was likely to incur political and other discursive impacts that precluded the ability to implement good policy, you give this debate to opening government. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on habitat protection and what we actually think this type of growth and stagnation looks like. Secondly, on the political impacts. And lastly, on growth and responding to their more extraneous points about not having more children. On that first point about habitat protection, they tell you that this necessarily, in order to grow, means you have to have more extractive activity. A couple of things in response here. Firstly, even if that was the case, that it necessitated more extractive activity, it was unclear to us as to how reducing the amount of supply of commodities was actually beneficial for these countries in the long term. I think that was probably quite problematic in the context of already quite high food prices. I think you increase food insecurity for individuals on the margins. Note the fact that we tell you at Rose that in the majority of instances, habitat destruction was happening for populations like bonobo apes was directly as a result of food insecurity for the local populations that lived nearby. We tell you insofar as we mitigate that harm, we mitigate the harm to animals. That is a direct impact that we get to mechanize in this debate. But secondly, they tell you oh, well, now you don't invest in human capital because you now have an incentive to do other things. It was unclear to us why exactly having decreased funding, why having a decreased fiscal capacity to do things like invest in education, like invest in healthcare, that undergirded the fiscal capacity and the human capital of that state, meant that you had an increased ability to do that. They don't prove the exclusivity about that benefit. I think that if you believe that these governments have less revenues with which to invest in education, to invest in healthcare, you would similarly believe that their human capital and their labor forces are probably compromised by that. They don't actually prove to you how decreased growth helps those people in that capacity. The second thing they tell you, though, is that now you have like better political will for the implementation of things like climate change. And I think the important weighing here that I'm also going to do is the long-term benefit that we get to accrue, which is to say that you now don't associate like climate change policy with something that is economically toxic and that has imperiled your country in the past. I think that people are likely to make this attribution bias for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that it comes after the heralding in of new growth models that center things like ESG, that prioritize the kind of environmental impacts and that link economic activity to those things. I think that secondly, the salience of climate change discourse politically is likely to mean that people have a cognitive association between this economic stagnation and what's happening. But I think that thirdly, it's the fact that climate change activists and advocacy associations are likely to make that direct link and frame it as a positive benefit. That is to say that they tie directly your material deprivation and poverty to a good thing that is happening for the environment. I think that's a lot of the rhetoric that opening opposition uses is going to be co-opted to paint this negative association. What does it mean protractedly in the long term, and why is that the most important way in consideration? I think that it means that irrespective of the fiscal capacity of governments to do this, there is a decreased political will intrinsically to do this. That means that regardless of whether or not you get back on your feet economically, the political conscience of that country now associates climate change policy, the protection of biodiversity, the protection of national parks, research into mitigating all of those implications with a direct cost to them. The long-term impact of that is huge, it is permanent, and it exists irrespective of the political conditions and the capacity to do that. What else do they tell you with respect to politics? They tell you like, oh, it's good now because people in developed countries don't have an incentive to be overly consumerist. I think that actually we flip this analysis and tell you that the ability for them to like now have like engage in markets that are eco-friendly only exists when they have that discretionary income to make those slight differences, which is to say that if I can barely afford food because oil prices are particularly high, and note the fact that they just have to cop that harm because they have less commodities in the market, you are less likely to be able to buy the more eco-friendly option. I think that you lock out good practices. If we're talking about animal welfare in this debate, locking out the types of farms that are taking care of animals is a direct harm that they have to cop in this debate because consumers don't have the extra discretionary income with which to make those decisions. And that's to tell you, like, this is good because now you don't have more children, and that's good for the environment and the economy and stuff. I think the first thing to say is that oftentimes those women in those situations where they're incredibly economically deprived didn't have the agency to access things like contraception. Those things weren't available. Note once again, we're going to link this to the capacity of governments to provide things like healthcare. We tell you that that necessarily decreases when the revenue of those governments from things like oil and extractive industries is decreased. If they want that benefit, they have to engage with the fact that they lose out on that. But the second thing to say there is this is obviously in tension with their analysis that they like want a growth in human capital, but they simultaneously want to plummet the amount of people that are being born in those countries. Before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
There doesn't actually have to be any kind of downturn in the economy for opponents of climate conservation to claim that shutting down oil rigs is bad for the economy because people get laid off.
But there does have to be, because if you shut down oil rigs, you are decreasing the supply of oil, and decreasing the supply of oil increases the price such that individuals on the margin feel that when they go to the supermarket and try to buy a loaf of bread and find out that it is now prohibitively expensive. We think that we clearly mechanize that to you all down our bench. You have to cop the harms of increased prices. Next, what do we tell you on growth and what this looks like? I think that this debate becomes hinged on a question of whether or not you believe that there are a plurality of ways you can access growth. Opening opposition comes out quite firmly and says that this only happens when you discover new reserves. I think the analysis we tell you grows is to say that companies have an incentive to do this, but it is secondary to their core profit incentives, means that now we get to unlock the benefits of being able to use that discretionary income to go towards things like climate preservation, to go towards things like mitigating bad dumping practices, like not having those environmental disasters. Those are all things that directly impact animals on a very direct basis. We think that at best, the impacts that they get are quite discursive and tenuous because they tell you, oh, now you mine less. We don't think that mining necessitates the destruction of habitats if it's done well. We're the side that characterizes to you that mining is likely to be done well. We tell you that's good. We tell you that being able to invest in habitat protection was good. What else they tell you? They tell you that, oh, habitat protection was already quite cheap to do. I don't think this was true for a couple of reasons. First of all, because that was largely dependent on the delivery capacity of these individual states. That was to say, how trained were they to do things like protect habitats, to create national parks to enforce those things, it's likely to be quite expensive for them relatively because they have to just allocate a greater degree of their budget toward other things. I think that's particularly true in the context of economic disaster and crises, at the point in which they have to divert attention into like mitigating other crises because people can't get food, because they perhaps have to have emergency transportation mechanisms for things like that. But the second thing to say here is that yes, maybe it's cheap for certain parts of the environment, but for the things that matter the most compromised ecosystems, it was not cheap. You needed that extra capital. We were the only side to benefit.
I would like to thank the DPM for their speech and then invite the DLO.
Can you see and hear me like this?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. When China was experiencing exponential economic growth, they did not care that the skies in Beijing were literally gray and the air was not breathable. Why? Because when there is economic growth, you can get your voters to be happy no matter what the state of the environment is, no matter if the bio-environment that we're living in is safe for any being. But now China, in seek of a soft landing because their GDP is stagnating, they have to say we have the Healthy China 2030 initiative because they want to distract away from the lack of economic growth. They have to use other moral arguments to legitimize their government locally and internationally, which is exactly why when there is economic growth, that's when you enable the most reckless disregarding of the environment that exists in today's debate. There's one clarification before three winning arguments for OO, which is just this debate is not about forcing oil rigs to shut down and then having people respond to that. It's not about forcing a world into economic stagnation or should we not do so and intervene. It's when the natural state is economic growth globally or economic stagnation, which one's better for animals. So everything about protests, about like people being unhappy about oil rigs shutting down is just simply irrelevant to this debate because it's just like that oil rig was never found because this is the world that we're living in. There was no economic growth whatsoever. Three things then. Firstly, I'm going to prove to you why consumption and therefore use of resources will just go up on their side. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why in like developing worlds and countries where in the prior phases of development, sustainable energy development will not be used on their side house. And lastly, why in richer countries, political buy-in for environmentalism is the most important thing, and we get this. But firstly then, why does consumption go up? For two reasons that I do not respond. One, on the population point. We get a very flippant response, which is just rich countries give birth less than poor countries. Sure, that might be their baseline. However, if you adjust the context of whether or not there's global economic growth, there will be different population policies and outcomes from that baseline. If there's economic growth, the government will think, I'm getting a lot of taxes, I have lots of welfare funding, I'm not worried about the system like being overwhelmed, therefore I'm not going to institute population policies, versus when there's more of a threat, there's economic stagnation, there's not an increase in productivity, our population is booming, we're not going to be able to afford food stamps, welfare, we're going to lose our legitimacy, they will institute population control measures such as like making contraceptives more accessible, sexual education, population policies that are more explicit, etc. So population is lower on our side from that baseline. On the individual level, when there's economic stagnation, you're not sure if you can afford the bills next month. You're not sure if you're going to keep up with inflation. That's when you're least thinking about having a kid because you don't even know if you can raise the kid. So from that baseline, our population is definitely lower. This is one of the biggest impacts on animals because farm factory animals is one of the cruelest things you can do. Incorporates a large quantity of animals, inflicts a great degree of suffering, and if population grows, which it does exponentially when we already have like billions and billions of people, this is when you have those measures that are unsustainable, bad, like degrades the environment when there's too many cows, and also are very, very cruel for these animals in the first place when this agricultural industrial complex expands. But secondly, consumerism, because global economic growth, at least on the bottom lines, means everyone has more spending power. Companies will try to take advantage of your increased spending power by telling you you need more goods, you need clothes every season, you need a new phone every few months. That's when they just will have to use more cotton, just have to use more rare earths to produce these phones for people. So there's more of an extraction of resources here when there's consumerism in this materialistic world in which we see all these goods as something that's desirable and companies know how to manipulate us using commercials and stuff like that. So consumption of these resources will just increase based on population growth and consumerism. But now let's delve into the developing countries' context. Let's talk about why they won't get sustainable energy investment, which is the bulk of their case. First of all, let's address this argument on the civil war. I think the opposite can be said. When there's economic growth, that means the government has extra money to spend and not just maintain the functioning of the government and like the basic services. That's when they're investing in the military. They're like developing nuclear weapons if they can, or like buying tanks and stuff to get ready for war and thinking about all these things. So that's just not true, and the opposite exists. Two, there's so many factors affecting civil war. They can't tell you economic stagnation is the reason when like religion, political differences, historical grievances, nationalism all play a part. The delta is extremely unclear. Lastly, the tie to animals is just very weak for this argument. Most nations who are going to civil war are unstable stable emerging democracies who are in the beginning of their developing phases, these are not the biggest emitters. They're not the biggest, like, taking over land, like burning down forests instead of factories. They're usually poorer nations who are just starting off. It's more about like the US and China and their emitting behaviors that affects animals way more. So this argument just does not matter. Onto their sustainable energy investment argument. This is where they're missing a lot of links. They say that the developing nations, in order to develop, they will like go into a direction of clean technology. First of all, no matter in which direction you have to head in, you need initial investment in the equipment or machinery to head in whatever direction you want to go from when you're starting as a poor nation and going towards manufacturing, which means the extraction of resources that Uma talks about is a prerequisite to anything, even clean technology. And they need to tell you why like going down and drilling to getting that quick cash, a big sum of money, it's something that doesn't hurt animals when it ruins habitats permanently in that one step. But second of all, like when you do have investment into economic development in these developing nations, you see a lot of things like oligarchs forming, like the rich class having more political power when they're like hold a lot of capital, hold a lot of land and stuff like that. They need to prove why they will use this money on clean technology for sustainable development when the oligarchs might just fund you for you to like buy more land, use other resources, and like support fossil fuels and lobby in all those ways. So I'm not sure why economic development has to look like clean technology when I do not prove it. But second of all, like most people in the developing world just care about increasing their quality of living as fast as possible. So they're not going for clean technology. They just want quick things that are felt, like building roads, building like structures, building cooler hospitals and schools. So again, unsure why there's clean technology just because they can support sustainable economic development that is continuous over time. Before I talk about the more important nations, the bigger emitters, I'll take a point from closing. Opening.
So we tell you that like fossil fuels are necessarily depleting, therefore sustainable growth cannot be contingent upon them. We also just tell you the empirical realities these companies investing in R&D. Please contend with that.
Yeah, because when you want to develop new technology, you need a big sum of money, the initial investment. Where are these countries going to magically get a big sum of money from? They're going to like extract resources very quickly, and that's going to ruin all this land and like open up all these mines, open up the risk of oil spilling in oceans and stuff like that. So as long as you want to grow, you don't want to maintain the status quo and like the current level of consumption that exists, you will have to face the spike in the amount of resource extraction that is possibly the most unsafe and the most everlasting in terms of effects. Lastly, in terms of the bigger emitters for like big governments like the US and China, there's no dichotomy between economic growth, like investment policies, and environmentalist policies. Money can come from a lot of other places, like the military, like campaigning money, like lobbying, stuff like that. These countries already have the technology like solar panels. It's just about forcing the implementation and like making sure that these policies are enforced. Like Uruguay uses more renewable energy than the US. It's not about wealth levels of developing these technologies. It's about giving governments the incentive to implement those policies. So why do we get people to care? One, only in an environment of somewhat pessimism, like the economy is not constantly growing. We can't just solve every problem that comes our way. But we buy into the problem-based rhetoric that the environment is dying. We have to do something right now. This is very drastic. So movements can better garner voter support for environmentalist policies when people are pessimistic, when there's economic stagnation instead of constant growth that makes us think, look, us humans, we can solve any problems that come our way. But two, only when there's no economic growth can governments not just easily credit claim based on I'm making you richer, therefore you should disregard everything. They'll want to whitewash your image and it legitimize their image, like China is doing with Healthy China 2030 when they're talking about the environment with domestic voters and internationally, which is when you get them to implement these policies. For all these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the DLO for their address, and I invite the member of government.
Excellent. Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, dope. For POIs, put them in the chat. I'll ask for one explicitly. So all that jazz. The missing frame from the opening half of this debate isn't that climate change is just a problem that poses to animals. It is that we are at a point of no return, which means the status quo of economic stagnation leaves us in a place in which current warming and current emissions have us on a collision course for economic destruction and mass extinction events for billions of animals. Economic stagnation gives us no pass out of the status quo, and the piecemeal solutions of conservation and green energy are insufficient to go back on the current emissions of the past in order to save us. From CG, we're going to give you an extension which provides the only avenue for potential solvency for these problems, that is geoengineering and a variety of other like crack pipe stuff that Nick has told me a lot about. Okay, let's jump into this case. So why do we think that geoengineering is the only avenue for growth, and how does this weigh us against the entire front half of this debate? One, we think that we need to get geoengineering now. That is, even if we realize 10 years down the line that we are fucked and we need to pursue geoengineering solutions, we have already missed our window of opportunity. That is, if states start doing things like carbon capture or sulfur dioxide emission in 2040, 2050, we think that this is insufficient to go back on the climate destruction, the ocean warming, the death of coral reefs, putting the Amazon rainforest at levels of forest fires and destruction, which it's never going to be able to come back on. We've passed the point of no return. There was a short window of opportunity here. Two, that even if individual countries take action on our side of the house, that is, even if we don't find solvency for the collective action problem, note that climate change is has a collective action problem on both sides, right? One, if all countries don't act to solve, I'll take you way later. Don't ask a POI at like 1 minute into the speech. Even if one country is even if all countries don't act to solve climate change, right? Having a few countries engaged in geoengineering, things like carbon capture, things like sulfur dioxide emission, these are global-wide effects, which means even if China or the United States are the only actors which act, this is often sufficient to provide mitigation to climate change and provide some mechanism of solvency. Finally, on most important to animals, I think it's just self-evident, right? If all animals go extinct, that's fucked. Unless Yo is going to run some crazy extension about all existence is suffering and extinction is actually good, right? We think that preventing mass extinction of animals is the only avenue. I think it's self-evident. Also because I think animals have a predisposition of wanting to continue to survive. Of course, we don't have epistemic access to the interests of animals, but at the point at which all animals reproduce and do a ton of stuff to continue to want to survive, I think we have a belief in that the animals want to continue existing, want to continue reproducing, have their offspring continue reproducing. I think it's self-evident that's the interest of animals. Okay, one differentiation from OG. OG only runs conservation and habitat protection. This is insufficient at the point at which we don't reduce emissions, we don't do things like carbon capture or sulfur dioxide emission, which go back on previous emissions. Because even if we take on conservation efforts or we reduce emissions in the present, this is still going to have us on a collision course of mass extinction anyway. So we can make a massive national park or we can engage in more sustainable mining methods, but that's insufficient at the point at which we're going to have warming of the oceans, which is going to lead to mass extinction of fish, and we have no alternative. So conservation and economic solvency is insufficient. Two, that we will actually mechanize why funding and economic prosperity will translate or is likely to translate into this economic growth and these technological developments versus OG's very flippant assertion that maybe money is a pathway, but even if we have money, why is that actually likely to translate into action? Okay, firstly, let's talk about the political action, because we get this very absurd characterization from OO in this round that people care about climate change when they are pessimistic. I think there's a couple things in this debate. People have a hierarchy of priorities when they engage in democracy. At the foremost of their prioritization is their economic needs and their survival, which means when we are in a period of economic stagnation, the thing which is going to take precedence in all political structures is people caring about their short-term economic interests. I can care about climate change, but I don't care about climate change as my foremost interest when I am struggling to put food on the table for my children. Obviously, on either side of the house, people care about climate change, but it is unlikely to be the priority of economic interest when you have political interest, when you have other economic interests superseding it in the debate. They tell you that this only happens in an avenue of pessimism. Note you can have different types of pessimism. You can have economic optimism and climate pessimism at the same time, which means when you exist in a period of economic prosperity, it is still people fear the existential risk of climate change and vote on this. Why is economic prosperity the only avenue to access this politically? One, short-termism. That is the prioritization of economic interests. When you have economic stagnation, means that these are going to be prioritization of political interests, and we're likely to see that this is what's going to be voted in. We see this in status quo, right? Our characterization when we saw economic concern and economic stagnation led to the rise of far-right populism. It didn't lead to green utopianism. We saw that people who are anti-climate change and saying we need to prioritize economic interest and also foment skepticism of climate change was likely to emerge in these contexts. Two, economic stimulus and the types of policies that governments are going to be forced to engage in periods of stagnation in order to win elections trade off with spending on other opportunities. That is, if I'm passing a multi-billion-dollar stimulus bill or a multi-billion-dollar thing to try and get people in jobs and food in people's mouths, I think this is going to be a trade-off with spending on carbon capture. You can only spend on these other options when you are forced to vote on those, when you have a larger expenditure budget and you're not forced to spend a ton on welfare and stimulus in the short term, trading off with these other options. Sure, I'll take a POI from opening.
This is an extremely scientifically dangerous extension. Studies show that geoengineering disrupts monsoon patterns and ocean chemistry that
so the problem with this is
negative.
Our case is very simple. We're fucked either way. Either geoengineering works and we have a secure path to security, or it doesn't work and we go extinct anyway. We are willing to take the Armageddon option, the 1% chance that it works, because even if it does, we are saved. If we don't do it at all, we're fucked. If we do it and it doesn't work, we're equally fucked. So I don't see a tipping point by which you can do nothing, and why that's better than trying the one option that we have on the table. Okay, 2, why is this the only avenue to access this technology? I think companies are only willing to invest in this technology, and governments are willing to invest billions in subsidization for this technology, A, when there's political will, but B, when you're in a period of economic stability and companies and governments are in a position where they can take on economic risk. Note, expensive R&D, which does not have guaranteed returns on the market, is only something you invest in when you know that you have excess surplus profit to invest in those like research and be able to move. At the point at which economic stagnation, you're in a period of a first mover disadvantage, which means it is unlikely that any government or any company is going to invest in R&D, because you know that you're wasting money in a highly competitive market where you're already struggling. Economic prosperity is the only avenue to do this. Our case, very simple. We're fucked. This is the only option we have. The only position for governments to have political will to act is when people don't have short-term economic concerns taking precedence, and economic prosperity is the only avenue to get R&D and afford implementation of this technology. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
I would like to thank the member of government for their address, and I now invite the member of opposition.
Actually, I've changed my mind. Thanks.
So, all right. You guys can. I would raise your hand. Raise your hand. All right. I'll get started then. On CO, we're going to be the first team to talk about animals like they actually matter. Being raised in a factory farm where you have literally no space to move, where you are being brought up and made to be overweight so that you cannot even stand, where you're being raised to be slaughtered and bleed out so that you can feed humans, is literally torture. We want to end this torture of the factory farming industry, which is required and only grows in the world of opening government and of government. And ending that is the biggest change that we can make for animal suffering in this debate. A couple of things. First, I'm going to deal with the extension that we got from closing government and explain what economic growth actually looks like and why that overcomes their challenges with respect to geoengineering. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why economic growth means far more demand for meat and factory farming and do much more than the 20 seconds we got in OO, and explain why that is actually so viscerally bad for animal suffering. First of all, in terms of dealing with the extension we got from Reese, I want to identify a couple of things. The only mechanism in this argument is actually this. It is that if I am wealthier, I am marginally more likely to care about climate change. And because I am marginally more likely about climate change, I actually do care about climate change. And all of the extension of like investing in geoengineering in like the very, very short term is just going to materialize. But this doesn't seem likely. The first thing is the absence of like being in a state of suffering because of economic stagnation, let's say, doesn't mean that you meaningfully care about climate change. In fact, when stuff is going really, really well, people are often biased to what they know. They don't understand a need to make shifts. They don't vote on that basis because they're pretty convinced that their life right now works really well, and they don't understand the need to shift that. But second, this just doesn't line up with our intuitions. It is the wealthy people that support the Republican Party in the United States that are ones that are saying that we shouldn't be switching to green energy. These are the people that are protesting. These are the people that are angry when Democrats suggest that we should have green legislation. So this suggests that economic well-being does not actually tie to the outcomes that they are suggesting. The second thing I want to suggest here then, and this is relatively like extension light, so it's kind of constructive, is to characterize what growth actually looks like. Because we haven't actually gotten an explanation of what this is going to be from either side in this debate. Our claim is that it looks like the excessive destruction of developing countries, because tapping into this consumer base is the only way that sustained economic growth can happen. There are 3 points that I want to make under this. One, in order for sustained economic growth to happen, multinational corporations need to enter the developing world en masse and set up hugely extractive industries to be able to tap into this consumer base. And the important thing is that these are the actors that actually stand in the way of climate change, because when boards are doing really well, they don't want you to invest loads and loads of that money into R&D. They want you to invest into expanding existing factories so they can continue to get stuff on their stock and continue to return that. This overcomes the clash that is pretty much washed out of the debate at this point about governments and what individual voters care about, and replaces it with what the economic interests of businesses are. Second, making tech shift toward like green technology is super uncertain in these areas. There are massive costs to doing it. It means you often have to build up things like power lines that aren't actually there in the first place. But more than that, you don't need to make the shift at all, because in the developing world, there aren't the competitors in the green space to promote this shift in the way that there are in the developed world. So as a result, tapping into these billions of new consumers and getting the economic growth from that doesn't require a green shift. But third, green tech exploits the developing world massively. You have to clear out fields like Elon Musk is doing to build like lithium batteries for Tesla, and that destroys land and it destroys animals and it kills all of these things. So that's really quite bad. Given that we've painted to you why economic growth means destroying the developing world and destroying the animals in it, let's move on to why economic growth destroys animals further in the form of the meat industry. At the top, note that factory farming is the single biggest threat to climate change and animals in particular. One, there is an extremely vicious cycle in that as animals are farmed more, they only contribute further to climate change, and that as that continues, animals get abused over and over. But second, because there are just loads of animals that are used in the process. They produce methane, which is something like 20 times more toxic than carbon dioxide. They rely on aggressive and destructive land use, which means that all of that land becomes unusable for the next 100 years or so after a factory farm has been set up. And thirdly, they are heavily dependent on agricultural demands. From OO, we get population probably grows because you are concerned about bringing children into this scary, fucked up world. And CG kind of takes this out in their POI, but the actual mechanism is much more simpler. It is that for sustained economic growth, you need to have some sort of sustained growth in demand. Now, growing consumer bases around the world doesn't look like just a billion people emerging suddenly in the United States. It looks like places in the developing world. It looks like South Africa. It looks like Indonesia. It looks like all of these other countries where there are huge numbers of people that do have possible buying power where it doesn't currently exist, but has to for their case to materialize. So why do these people end up being problematic for factory farming? One, there are just far more people who eat meat. There are more people, lots of them eat meat. There are more people eating. Second, if people get richer, they tend to consume exponentially more meat than the average person because they just eat more. They have more meals. But more than that, there is greater meat consumption because this is what is expensive, it is what is prized, and it is what is considered socially delicious by plenty of people, so they end up eating this as well. But third, these businesses are just huge. There is so much power to sway you in the form of advertisement, but there are monopolies in many cases, so needing to shift in the first place is just super questionable. I'll take OG. CG?
Yeah, so in status quo, like, oh, go ahead, OG, go ahead.
No.
The meat industry is incredibly entrenched and can set prices uniquely low and monopolize in relation to alternatives that have higher production costs like soy. That means that in times of economic deprivation, cheap meat is bought more, which means that you actually increase the relative demand. You don't decrease the supply.
Yeah. Sorry, this has been like 40 seconds. This is not more than like a billion new consumers coming, a lot of them being super rich, a lot of them buying meat. It's just more expensive. So like maybe in times of economic downturn, but like overall, it is just so much for your side. Okay, I took like forever. Why doesn't this economic growth mean substituting toward veganism? One, there's a cultural connection to meat in a lot of cases. It is central to many Christian and Jewish celebrations. So this continues to be eaten into the long term. You can't make the switch. Second, veganism is mostly a fad. People don't perceive it as healthy anymore all that much, and it is isolated to liberal spaces where there's where this struggle actually matters, but that isn't the majority of the world. Third, it's extremely expensive to the point that R&D trade-off to like develop through stem cells meat just doesn't make sense, because compared to this, you can can just keep killing animals and serving them rather than investing billions and billions of dollars in trying to do something when people already buy your product. What is the weighing here, and why does this win? One, you are killing animals literally at the biggest scale. This is certain. You slaughter them, you chop their head off, and you feed it to people on a platter. This is violent and awful, and that is huge animal suffering. Second, this is the only area where we prove demand doesn't move, because it doesn't matter where people have incentives in terms of green energy. It's just that people continue eating meat always, and that is the most visceral thing. This is so much crueler to animals than any other thing. It is literally a farm to slaughter them. This matters in quality of harm and quantity. On that grounds, opposed.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for their address, and I now invite the government whip.
Alrighty, fantastic. Am I audible?
Yes.
Cool. I'm going to call for a POI roughly halfway through. From top half. Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Go. We explain why all other alternatives to avoiding complete global extinction fail. Why? Because other alternatives fall up against the collective action problem, and they can fall up against government short-termism. We explain why geoengineering uniquely doesn't have these same problems. Why? Because an individual rich country like the United States, China, or India can do geoengineering unilaterally insofar as they spray sulfur dioxide directly into their atmosphere, and it spreads across the entire world. Second, it avoids the short-termism problem because geoengineering works really, really fucking fast. When a volcano went off in the 1987, it caused an immediate global winter. Geoengineering operates under the exact same principle. Particles in the air, they reflect the sunlight. Okay, great. Why exactly do we get way more geoengineering on our side when you have more growth? Two main reasons. First, we explain on the government level, governments now have way more money to be able to be working with, and they now have the political incentive to be investing in climate change, as Reese explained to you. But perhaps even more importantly, this also operates on the company level as well. I'll explain that in response to Isaac's refutation to our case. Isaac refuted our case by saying, well, wealthy people always oppose climate change policy. This is obvious. But here's the problem. They actually kind of love geoengineering, especially fossil fuel companies. Why? Because if geoengineering works, it'll let these companies keep emitting more and more CO2 emissions into the air forever, safe in the knowledge that the geoengineering particles will reflect the sunlight and thus prevent the earth from going totally collapsed. So importantly, if there's growth, and if these companies now have extra profit to sort of float, to mess around with on risky things like R&D on geoengineering, then they will be able to do so, and they will be incentivized to do so. So that's how we get significantly more policy. So when we explain to you why it is that we are absolutely on track for global extinction if we don't do something like geoengineering, then obviously our case, which is far from certain to save the world, is still better. We explain on this point, we explain exactly why it is that given prior emissions and given the fact that methane and CO2 stay in the atmosphere for sometimes 20 years, sometimes 100 years, causing continual emissions, what we need to do is not just stop emissions, which is the best case on their side. We need to actively remove emissions and reflect sunlight to prevent sunlight from being trapped by CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. We show geoengineering is the only way out. Okay, two other miscellaneous responses to our case. First, there was the objection that, well, if stuff is going well, people won't really want to make changes. Here's the problem with this. Sure, people are going to see the economy's going well, but they're still obviously going to see climate devastation. They're still going to see floods. They're still going to see their own country go into shit. They're still going to see mass climate exoduses across the world. So they're still obviously going to see that there's an impetus for a meaningful climate action. Second response to our case was that geoengineering has bad externalities, and I'm pretty sure that's what the POI is. Yes, this is true, but it's still better than extinction for animals. Obviously, this debate is about animals. Animals want to live. They want a world to exist in. They don't want to hit the sort of positive feedback loops that will cause basic global extinction, as I'll expand on later in my weighing against OG. Okay, that's our case. Let's talk OG. First, all of their stuff on corporations that aren't fossil fuel companies, like maybe doing climate stuff a little bit better, honestly, has no delta whatsoever, because most corporations are profit maximizers, and so they're going to destroy the economy on either side of the house if it's profitable to do this. They don't want to waste their extra profit on going green. I note my earlier analysis on fossil fuel companies is different from this, because fossil fuel companies, when they have the capacity, are likely to invest in geoengineering in order to avoid governments regulating them out of existence, in order to avoid carbon taxes putting them out of existence, so they do have a direct profit incentive to do this. All the companies that OG talks about don't. Okay, next let's talk about their political stuff. Their only mech is people are now going to associate stagnation with green policies, but this is a weak mech for the reason that CEO pointed out. There's always an association of climate policy with economic damage, kind of because it's just true that when you have caused massive disruptions to an economy for the pursuit of completely redoing its economics or completely redoing its energy system that has environmental, economic harms. Excuse me. We give far better mechs, as Reese explained to you. Next, they say there's going to be less political will for fighting climate change on the other side. But what OG crucially failed to do is explain how, on our side, on the gov side, governments can successfully avoid global extinction. They never said which technologies can be used. They never explained why they're going to be viable. So, because they never explained how we can avoid the Earth becoming uninhabitable, they obviously fall under us. They mainly discuss small deltas in biodiversity, but obviously do the weighing here. Is it worse for a frog pond to collapse, or is it worse for the Gulf Stream to collapse? There's tons of positive feedback loops that we need to avoid hitting. There's things like the ice caps melting, which leads to less reflexivity, which again has positive feedback loops for warming. We need to avoid the permafrost melting, releasing ancient emissions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously our impacts on the climate are way more severe. And so because animals care about being able to exist and not having suffering and not losing their environments, et cetera, we obviously take it over them. Okay, yes, I'll take that POI from Isaac.
People just don't believe that the end result of climate change is extinction. Like, scientists just don't think this. Convincing them of such is required to get your shift, which seems super improbable as compared to a massive decrease in production given all of our claims.
Okay, the average reasonable voter has heard time and time again that if we don't do something in 12 years, we have a realistic chance of going extinct. We're not saying it's a certainty that we're going to go extinct. Like, yeah, again, everything here is speculative. Climate models aren't perfect, but there's still a realistic chance of us hitting sort of tipping points that will lead to maybe not global extinction, but at the very least, warming that is so great that animals realistically cannot exist in the vast majority of the world, or at the very least in massive amounts of deaths, die-offs, et cetera. Because we've seen global extinction events in the past caused by climate. I don't see why it's entirely unfeasible there'll be another one this time. Again, even if you don't buy our absolute worst case, we still beat our opening half. Okay, let's talk OO, then let's talk CG. So, or CO. So first, OO says that growth only happens because there's going to be more oil. The problem is threefold. First, oil doesn't unilaterally decide the path of the global economy. I have no idea why we should assume that this growth comes from oil. Second, there's other possible explanations for why the economy is growing in our world. It might be that there's a breakthrough in green energy. It might be that there's a breakthrough in AI, increasing productivity. Growth doesn't just come from demand. Quit lying about that, Isaac. Third, even if this is true, it's probably good to go from dirty coal in countries like China and countries like the developing world to oil, or even better, to natural gas, which is another possible explanation for why this growth happened. Okay, they say green tech is already sufficiently developed, things like wind and solar. This destroys our opening half totally, but it completely misses our case because we're talking about tech that is insufficiently developed. Geoengineering, which still needs tons and tons of investment capital in it to become viable at scale. Same with carbon capture and storage. Next, they say that people won't want radical change, that people will want radical change when faced with stagnation, but they never explain why they're going to specifically demand the radical change that this debate is about. Why won't they demand racism? Why won't they demand authoritarianism? All these things are neutral for animals. Next, they say, well, you're going to go green, but the problem we explained crucially, Reese did, why it is that stagnation means that there's bigger issues than fighting climate change, so there's little political impetus for fighting climate change. I promise I'm going to get to CO eventually. Okay, a few more things in response to OO. They say you're going to have to distract from stagnation via climate policy, but as we explained, governments won't do this because it would probably make the economy worse to do meaningful climate policy, like entirely changing the energy system, and this will hurt the economy in the short term. So to be super disruptive, governments wouldn't do it. They're probably going to have to do like carbon taxes. That'd be bad. Okay, next they say that consumption goes up when growth goes up, but the problem is it's probably a wash against consumption becoming more ethical. On our side, when you have more growth, people can afford to engage in conscientious consumptions, things like buying free range chicken, and this will be something that consumers can now afford. This takes out the factory farming stuff. Next, they say there's more extraction for green tech, but obviously this is outweighed by all the benefits of green tech, and this hits OG more than CG because you don't have to extract much for sulfur dioxide geoengineering. Okay, lastly, we get to CO. In response to factory farming, first, I've already responded to this via the point on conscientious consumption, avoiding factory farming. Next, this is outweighed by us saving all the animals. Next, poor people in China, America, everywhere can afford to buy meat in status quo. There's very little change. Lastly, it's honestly unclear whether it's better for a factory farmed animal to not exist at all than to exist. Sure, their life has suffering, but we have to impose human utilitarian objective metrics of whether life is worth living onto them. I don't know whether that's meta-ethical legitimate. Okay, next they say to talk about growth, meaning multinational corporations go into new countries. There's no delta here. They do this on both sides because it's pretty certain profit. Lastly, they say green tech exploits the developing world. This is obviously outweighed by the fact that we have the potential for saving the world. We should weigh all the future animals, the trillions, the tens of trillions, the quadrillions of animals that we have the potential to save on our side. Take the gamble, do the game theory, do the math. For all those reasons, CG.
I would like to thank the government whip, and I'd invite the opposition whip.
I want to start with the meat industry because I think that's the voter that's going to win us the round. I think Isaac sort of explained to you why it is the case the demand for meat exponentially increases when you have stability and economic growth, whereas this doesn't happen if we continue to stagnate because populations largely remain the same, because the forces that Gulbench likes to talk about how like some people might move to soy maybe kicks in at some point. We get two sets of responses. The first is that people actually eat more meat when they're poor, coming from OG. Maybe this is true in the developed world when you're, woke and I'm like living in California, but in the developing world, people really, really love meat. Like culturally, it's just associated with status and class. You eat meat on festivals, like when Ramadan ends, for example, like at Chinese New Year. When you can eat meat, you eat it. And that's like the foundation of like Chinese cuisine nowadays, for example. But two, I also just think it's the case that their claim from CG that the status quo is already really heavily meat eating is just really lazy debating, because it's like, oh, it's actually a wash because there's already some meat consumption to begin with. Like, listen to Isaac's speech, right? There are lots of things that change. The first thing is there's population growth in areas that are currently, you know, largely already growing in size, like Nigeria, for example. Like population is going to grow a lot. Like this is like 30% extra number of mouths, for example, in the long term, whereas this doesn't happen in a world where economic remains stagnant. But number two, right, maybe some people in the middle class are already doing well, but the point of developing is that this group of middle class people increases over time, which means the number of people who are also buying meat increases. I think this is pretty uncontroversial. There are many, many millions more of mouths that happen on their side compared to ours. What's the weighing of this argument? Because we're weighing literally hundreds and thousands of animals that get consumed on their side that don't on our side in a world with less human demand. I think that there are three reasons why this outweighs every other issue in the debate, especially given that all other teams have largely talked about climate change. The first reason is because, like, if you check your notes, people have generally been pretty like slack about making the link from climate change to animal suffering, other than saying habitation loss, which unclear how many animals this affects every single year, for example, which is, I think the suffering that each individual animal experiences on a factory farm is way worse than suffering an individual animal experiences when they're out on a habitat, of habitat loss, right? The reason being, the suffering that an animal experiences on a farm is everyday and it is constant. It is also that never refuse to heal. It's prolonged pain because the farmers want to keep you alive in order to eat you at some point. On the other hand, the suffering that happens when an animal dies because of exposure, for example, or because their home is destroyed in a wildfire is bad, but it is ultimately short-term, number one. And B, the kind of suffering that happens in nature all the time. Like animals get eaten, they starve to death, like this just happens. On the other hand, the kind of torture that animals undergo on a farm is exponentially worse. Number two, the quantity of animals that suffer on our side is way, way larger because there are only so many habitats that can be destroyed. And once the habitat is destroyed, there are no more animals that continue dying in it. On the other hand, when an animal in a factory farm dies, it gets replaced by another. That cycle repeats again. Empirically, the most populous warm-blooded animals on the planet are now rats, chicken, pigs, and cows. These are largely because of human demand. The number of animals that die is just mind-boggling. Like if you close your eyes and imagine it, it's catastrophic. The final thing is, I'm going to respond to Nick's little, but how can we really know the preference of animals? By saying, I think it's pretty obvious that an animal is suffering when it is flinching away from pain, for example, when it can barely move. We don't know the preferences of animals in the same way that we don't know the preferences of other human beings because there's an epistemic gap. We all just make inferences based on the way animals and humans react. And when animals are obviously miserable and depressed and experiencing pain because they have nervous systems, we can infer that they're experiencing copious amounts of suffering. And I think that that's a huge reason to vote for us. I'll take OG.
Economic growth means women get to go to work and get to get an education. That decreases the birth rate and delays when they're likely to have children. Please engage in the empirical reality of what actually happens.
So a couple of things here. The first thing is, I just don't like the claim that that people stop having children because they're quote unquote more educated. I think that is quite complicated. I think on either side, the distribution of birth control, for example, is something that is happening with modernization. But the second main thing is that I just also think that the population isn't the full story, because when people become richer, they also become able to purchase meat at far greater rates. But number three, like meat companies want to capture new like populations, that kind of thing. Like at best, what you're telling me is some mitigation. Okay, so I think that given that our issue is enough for us to win the round without engaging with any other team, I'll still beat other teams though. So first on CG, geoengineering, 3 sets of responses. First is people don't actually care because they've just committed logical fallacy after logical fallacy. The economy becoming better overall doesn't mean individual people become richer, which also responds to the POI that OG just gave me and a lot of the mechs in their case as well. Because implicitly, because of a few things. Number one, oftentimes inflation happens, cost of living also increases, but B, population also increases, which means like the gains in demand become distributed amongst more and more people. People trap themselves into larger purchases and remain under constant economic stress because they enter mortgages, for example, they enter debt. Like all of these things mean that people are still going to struggle to provide for themselves. But number two, not starving doesn't mean that you therefore care about the environment. Those are not the only two things that exist. Think about abortion, LGBTQ+ rights. These are things that affect people far more directly than climate change does. Two, the fact that geoengineering is the only option does not mean that it'll work. One, a lot of the thresholds that they're talking about have already been crossed, like glaciers are already melting. That's megatons of carbon dioxide that has already been placed into the ocean. In order for their case to work, you would have to create a shit ton of carbon sinks within a very, very small span of time, like 10 years, for example. They've proven that maybe hypothetically in the future, these economic pressures get resolved. That won't happen in time, but they have to outpace economic activity. And Isaac's explained to you why this is dirty economic growth. It's not symmetric, unlike what the POIs that they're telling us are, because you often want to prioritize gains now in developing countries as opposed to wanting to have green growth in the long term. On OG, I think the biggest issue they have is just that there's no counterfactual analysis. I'm just happy to buy that a lot of these practices are like that economic stagnation comes with some practices that are bad for animals. They don't explain to us why in a richer world that conflict doesn't exist, for example. They don't explain why green investment necessarily happens when people become richer, even if they don't happen when there's sustained economic growth. Finally, again, everything just gets outweighed by animal suffering. Happy to oppose.
I would like to thank the op whip and everyone for the debate. Please leave the room and then we'll call you back when we're done. Can you also stop the recording, whoever's recording?